Hello and welcome to the Everyday Adventure podcast. My name is Nikki Bass and I will be bringing you thoughts and ideas and hopefully some inspiration on how to build more adventure into your everyday life. So today I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Cornelia Oosthuizen to the show. Cornell is somebody I've known for over 10 years. We served in the army together. We both deployed to Afghanistan at the same time. And even back then, she struck me as somebody who was incredibly determined, resilient, and she also had a fantastic sense of humour and we got on straight away. And when I first thought of setting up this podcast, Cornell was the first person who sprang to mind. So Cornell is a professional wheelchair tennis player. She's a fledgling sports commentator and she is a Paralympic hopeful, hoping to compete at the Paralympic Games next year. And to me, she has always epitomised what the phrase silver linings is all about. I will let her share her story in her own words, but needless to say, I hope you are inspired by what she has to say as I have been by her journey. So Cornell, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on. I guess my first question really is if I could ask you just to share a bit about your story of how you came to be a professional tennis player, where it started from, and what inspired you really to pursue that path.
To be fair, since I was a kid, really, about 4 years old, my first proper childhood dream was to become a tennis professional and to win Wimbledon. That didn't quite work out for me, able-bodied, but towards the back end of my military career, I sustained a sports injury, which led to me being medically discharged, and it affected my right lower limb in terms of my right leg. And through actually a fellow tennis player in the Royal Air Force, she sort of kicked me up the backside when I was feeling a bit sorry for myself with all of this malarkey going on, to go and trial for the Invictus Games. And I was very fortunate to be selected for the UK team that represented the country in Toronto in 2017. And one of the disciplines I participated in and competed in was the wheelchair tennis, which I absolutely loved and adored. And to be fair, footwork was never a strength. So frankly, playing tennis on wheels has hopefully served me better than perhaps on my 2 feet. And then, as a result of that, I was fortunate to be identified by the Lawn Tennis Association for their talent identification program, and also through Help for Heroes, one of the charities heavily involved with the Invictus Games, for the Paralympic Inspiration Program in association with the British Paralympic Association. And as of the beginning of 2019, I was essentially taken on board on the Lawn Tennis Association's performance pathway for full-time wheelchair tennis players. And now, gunning for, hopefully fulfilling most, if not all of my ambitions in that regard.
Amazing. And I know you recently started doing a bit of commentating as well. How was that? You've gone from being a player as well as being behind the mic.
Yeah, it's very different. It's actually really hard work mentally, because you obviously can't just sort of, say anything and then shoot off the hip. But it's very useful to obviously learn more of the game by virtue of observing it and commentating actively on it. It's really enjoyable, but if given a choice, I'd still prefer to play tennis for a bit longer before I perhaps dip into commentating a bit more, unless it's a hint from the the LTA to go, well, Susan, maybe you should just stick to commentating and leave the tennis to us.
At least there's an alternative you need it, I guess. But it's also, I suppose, really interesting, that point about actually sometimes observing other people and being forced to observe really notice, as opposed to just watching on TV like the rest of us do, but how that then impacts on your own game as well and how you progress as a player, I suppose. So, I know that you've faced a lot of challenges since 2014 and that initial diagnosis. There must have been challenges you've faced as well on this journey of becoming a professional tennis player. What are the sort of things that you feel, actually, I'm really proud to have overcome that, or actually that wasn't something I expected, but you know what? it's taken me in a place that actually, it's taken me a step further than maybe I would have got to before.
I think for me, the most poignant aspect is probably, so at the back end of 2018, as a result of the medical condition that I had developed in my leg, I had an elective amputation below my right knee, which was obviously a fairly big surgery and clearly had some obvious practical impacts on my life. And so actually getting used to being in the wheelchair with a slight imbalance was initially a bit interesting, in that I initially played sort of without a prosthetic. Then we attached a prosthetic to the tennis chair and we sort of played around with it a bit. And also, obviously, certainly throughout 2019, the stump was still very much in a healing process. So that was a bit tricky, I suppose, to manage the intensity that you needed to train full time and obviously be as fit as you can with the reality of also having gone through a fairly robust surgery. And then I think the other thing as well, from a tennis perspective, has been mentally competing as an amateur versus competing as a professional are two very, very different beasts. And I've always loved, competing. And there's a phrase in the military, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. I've always had a healthy dose of red mist in my system. But certainly as a professional, it's been important to learn how to channel that red mist more constructively and more effectively than perhaps you might as an amateur. And that's obviously still a process that I'm learning and becoming better at. And I'm enjoying very much as well. And then just the sheer difference in movement on court because you're in a wheelchair. For those listeners who perhaps are not familiar with tennis as a sport, when you're on your feet, you tend to move from side to side and towards the ball. Whereas if you're in a wheelchair playing tennis, it's very counterintuitive in terms of movement compared to what you may have done as an able-bodied player because you're moving diagonally and often away from the ball to give yourself a bit more time to get to it. So your brain sort of, as having been an able-bodied player before, I'm still very much thinking as an able-bodied player when I move in the chair, but obviously slowly but surely that balance is turning, which is helping my cause along, it's really important.
Gosh, that's really fascinating, isn't it? Because that's probably not something that, I wonder if that's something that you considered you would have to adapt to before being in that situation. Certainly that sort of, in a way, disconnect between what your body is doing and what your mind thinks it's doing. Do you get sort of, I don't know if support's the right word, but for like sports psychologists who are able to help you marry up those two elements? Or is it, I guess, like you said, part of it's the experience of just getting used to?
Yeah, with regards to the mental side of sort of performing as a professional, we do have a sports psychologist that we can see on a weekly basis, as in when we're not touring, and playing tournaments abroad. She's coincidentally also the sports psychologist we happen to have for the Toronto Invictus Games. So I coincidentally got to know her there, which was a nice link to have had when she then obviously pitched up at the LTA. So that was really useful to have that. Have established a relationship in that regard before. And then practically with regards to the movement, we also do a lot of movement drills that sort of reinforce sort of the motions of it so that you retrain essentially your body and sort of the muscular remembering as such. So you sort of unlearn the old approach with a view to relearn the new approach. And then over time, that balance should hopefully tip in the right direction, which it is starting to do. It just doesn't happen overnight, which if you're impatient, sometimes you need to remind yourself.
Going back to the red mist, yeah.
Yeah, a little bit.
Awesome. So I guess my next question is sort of slightly related in that, there's obviously the benefit of, like you said, being able to realize a dream, albeit in a slightly different way, but still nonetheless, to be playing professional tennis is just incredible. So there's the sort of obvious benefits of doing this, but I'm just wondering in terms of what have been some of the unexpected benefits? So the things that you didn't necessarily even know would happen, or, that you've, so I guess, reflected back on as they've occurred.
Well, I've always been a massive tennis geek. So by virtue of training at the National Tennis Centre in Roehampton, I every now and again have the privilege of bumping into the likes of, Andy Murray and Heather Watson and some of the, the legends of the British game. I'm not by any means not yet mates with any of them, if ever. But as a tennis geek, you sometimes just, stop and take a moment. And especially around Wimbledon time, some of the other international players tend to train around that area as well. So sometimes you just literally go, oh my word, I've literally just walked past, like, don't stalk. So from a tennis geek perspective, yeah, exactly. Like, don't ask them for a selfie. Don't do it.
Oh, no, I'm doing it now. Yeah.
So that's really cool from a more platonic perspective. But actually also being exposed to, I suppose, a broader world of disability, which until I myself was injured, I just had no idea about. I wasn't exposed to it really much, if at all, in my life, especially in the military and also within my family and stuff. And so actually what's been really useful is getting to learn so much more about people with a wide variety of disabilities that play tennis in the wheelchair tennis world. And hopefully by extension, becoming a slightly less ignorant individual in that regard. Because even now, at times, I'm still astounded by my own level of ignorance, even though I'm also now classed as disabled or differently abled. And so really in that regard, it's been fascinating to learn and to get to know people who, perhaps, I don't know, 10 years ago, I would have also done a double take to go, gosh, that's a person in a wheelchair, or he's missing a leg or whatever. But actually, like anyone, they're just normal people. And once you get to know them, it's wonderful to see and experience how quickly you forget about the disability or the wheelchair or whatever the context might be, and that you can just look at them as people, and hopefully vice versa. It's sort of the same, for you as well, because I think for me, having been able-bodied and then becoming disabled later in my life, initially that I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder about that, and I felt quite self-conscious about it, that actually that was more my problem, frankly, than it necessarily being a real genuine issue. So that sort of transition in terms of my own perspective and my own ideas about myself and my identity, and by extension other athletes that are just differently abled, has hopefully also changed for the better. So actually in that regard, it's been a pleasant surprise. So yeah, hopefully that covers it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think, sort of broadening it out more widely, because I guess it's something I've become more and more conscious of. And I was also thinking prior to us chatting for the podcast as well, that so many, when we're talking about some of the adventures that people undertake and that we've certainly discussed as part of this podcast, and so many of them rely on you being able to access spaces. And in order to access them, actually, you have to be able to physically access them. I'm just thinking, even the simple act of, right, let's go for a walk in the park to get your headspace cleared, or, hiking, whatever it is, actually, that I think in a way that there is so much we take for granted, but that also, like you said, just being able to see it from a different perspective and go, hold on, that's a responsibility for all of us, not just for people who are, it's not the people who are struggling or who can't access these spaces, that actually the responsibility sits with everybody to try and, like you said, extend those too. And I guess I was just wondering about sort of more widely than tennis. Is that something that you've encountered and that has surprised you as you've, gone along on this journey, or, what have been your experiences?
Yeah, a little bit. Again, I suppose I'm, in relative terms, very fortunate, because I have the option of donning a prosthetic leg when I need it. That's been a bit of a hit and miss process so far, but fundamentally I can walk if I need to, or if I must. And that makes a big difference. So we were, for example, just last week rather, away at a tournament abroad on the seaside, or rather very close to the seaside. And the guys and girls in wheelchairs couldn't really access the beach because there wasn't, a wooden jetty that would extend far enough. Whereas I was very lucky the last morning, I had a bit of extra time. So I sort of hobbled along on the prosthetic to the beach, and I was able to hop into the sea, because I can use my leg. Whereas if I was fully wheelchair bound, no chance. And it's simple things like that where you go, actually, often the practicalities to help people along that might be less able physically to get stuck in with an adventure is not always as insurmountable as it might appear. Granted, sometimes it is, mounting Everest in a wheelchair. I'm all for, up for a challenge, but that's probably going to be logistically a bit
to be
more
fair,
of a
mounting
beast.
Everest at all, yes. Oh my goodness.
Granted. So I think it's all relative, but also more often than not, the attitude of the guys and girls that I've met so far is very humbling, because, they just get on with it one way or the other, or sort of do what they can to the best of their abilities, or to the best that the opportunity or the situation allows them to. And they're not held back per se, they're not sort of sat at home, waiting their lives away. Actually, a lot of them do phenomenal stuff quite consistently as a way of life. So in that regard, it also helps you to regain perspective, perhaps when you start to feel a bit sorry for yourself, but also to think about practical ways in which actually it can be quite easy to make things a bit more accessible for more people.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And like you said, actually, when you see what people are capable of and get round and overcome. Like you said, that's really useful, I think, to reflect on when, you feel like, certainly from me, when I'm thinking, well, I don't really feel like going for a run, or I don't feel like doing this today, which happens quite regularly. you can go, okay, well, like you said, there is the option there, and it's something I don't have to think about. And I think when certainly with so many of the discussions I've had around inclusivity and accessibility, particularly in outdoor spaces, it's about when you have the privilege of not having to think about something.
Granted,
and just reflecting on that. So I guess, I know a little bit about what's next, because we've talked about what hopefully will be coming, COVID permitting and all that. Have you got any other, are there any other things that actually, having got started with the tennis, that you think actually that this is something else that I'd really like to give a go, or I'd like to achieve?
Well, I think this, frankly, even though I've obviously had a number of good jobs in my time, especially in the military, this is by far the best day job I've ever had. I'm not going to lie. And I do savor it, every morning. In addition to being a tennis geek, it is literally as close as you can get to heaven on earth, frankly, in my book. But I think, for me, it's tennis-wise, obviously improving my singles ranking to the degree that I could hopefully qualify for the Paralympics in Tokyo. Failing that, hopefully the Paralympics in 2024 in Paris would be the next medium-term goal, and then equally improving my ranking to hopefully go and compete and ideally win some Grand Slam tournaments, because for wheelchair tennis players at the moment, the draws for the Grand Slams are tiny. It's the top 7 to 8 players in the world. So I've got a little way to go yet before my ranking is in the single digits, but I'm up for a challenge. So and it's just making sure I can obviously optimize my ability as a tennis player and hopefully develop my craft to the extent that you would expect a professional to do. But beyond that, I'd love to. I still have a fair bit of adventurous fire in my bones. And actually, even though I know we sort of jested about scaling Everest in wheelchairs, potentially a group of us might be able to get to base camp, for instance. Or I certainly want to visit, both the North and the South Pole at some stage still. So perhaps with organizations like the Endeavour Fund, Walking with the Wounded, and or a number of other, charities with a military bent as such, there may well be opportunities in the future. I'd love to circumnavigate the world solo in a sailboat, swim the channel, so I better crack on with all
yes, not much then.
Well, like to keep busy. So no, and we'll see with technology as well, especially in the prosthetics context. Fingers crossed, in 3 to 5 years, it may well become much more realistic than it might be at the minute. And I may well just have to marry for money and not for love to fund all my adventurous expeditions. So no, that
it's good to have a plan, though.
Absolutely.
And I absolutely have no doubt that if anyone's going to do all of those things, it will absolutely be you. So we'll be getting you back on the show when after your channel sim and all the rest of it as well. Amazing.
Thank you.
So if there's anyone listening to this who's thinking, actually, I want to get started, whether it's in a sport or an adventure context, and having those sort of doubts around, can I do this? How do I even begin? You've done some really adventurous, and I know throughout your entire career in the army and since, you've done so many sort of adventurous things, and way more adventurous probably than the norm would be considered, the baseline. But what's the one piece of advice that you'd give someone?
I think it is to just go for it. So inevitably, there's moments where you think, can I? You see perhaps other people do it and you're like, oh, good for them, but I can't do it. Actually, more often than not, just deciding to start something is actually the biggest step, and then just embracing it as you go along. That's not to say you won't doubt yourself, or you might not, you may encounter fear or whatever, but actually, more often than not, when you look back to it, it's often literally that choice of going, do you know what, come hell or high water, I'm going to do it. And then by all means, do your research. Again, we're so lucky in this day and age that there's access to gain to people who've done something similar before. If you need more information or you want to know, more about the realities, then pick their brains. People on average tend to be very happy to sort of share, their experiences. And you might, well, in my experience, more often than not, you tend to surprise yourself as well, pleasantly, more often than not, by sort of actually extending your limits. And it doesn't have to be scaling Mount Everest for the first adventure. It might just be going for a 10-minute run every day for the first, 2 or 3 months, and then pushing that up to a 15-minute run. You'll know your temperament, obviously, much better than anyone else. So scale it in accordance to what you're initially sort of comfortable with, but also a little bit uncomfortable with, and then just sort of inch along. And before you know it, you'll be scaling Everest.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I love that. I call it nibbling at the edge of your comfort zone. It's just...
Yes, that's a great phrase. Yeah, and take some snacks. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And always
snacks.
Never take a risk on snacks. Always.
Yeah, no. Pack enough of those.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Cornelia. If people want to find out more about your journey or follow you and find out more about what you do, where can they go?
I think the best place is probably just my website, which also has links to my social media. Although I need to acknowledge I'm a bit of a social media. I sort of surface for, one or two posts and then disappear for about 2 or 3 months. But yeah, just corneliaoosthuizen.co.uk. And then, obviously would love for anyone to follow my journey, and I'll try my best to do, everyone proud.
Brilliant. Thank you so much again. It's been such a pleasure to speak. I could carry on chatting for a very long time, but I will stop there. And like I said, I need to leave space to get you back in when the next adventures kick in too. And very best of luck with all your training and competitions as well. I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Take care.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks.
Bye. So as I mentioned in my introduction to the interview, one of the reasons I wanted to speak to Cornel for this podcast was because she was one of the inspirations for me setting it up. That was for a number of different reasons, but one of those reasons is that, to me, Cornel really embodies what we mean when we talk about resilience. And I just wanted to touch on that word resilience this week because it's one of those words that gets thrown around and bandied around so often, and particularly at the moment, I don't think a day goes by when I don't see it mentioned on a LinkedIn post or, on social media. And resilience is really important, but I also think that we don't necessarily have a common understanding of what resilience actually is and what it means. And I think it is used to represent so many different aspects of how we feel about ourselves or how we are able to act when we're faced with challenging situations. And that might mean that we're able to just get through it in the moment, or that we are digging in and keeping on going. But actually, resilience is something that is subtly different from that. And to me, one of the best ways to think about resilience, it's a question I always ask. The first question I always ask whenever I'm running a workshop for clients, whether that is a corporate workshop, whether it is individual clients, the first thing I always ask is, what is resilience? And I get them to think about an analogy. And I like to use nature as an analogy because I think it's a very good way of illustrating the point. So I get them to think about, okay, what's one thing in nature that you consider to be really resilient? And I usually get a whole span of answers ranging from cockroaches to dandelions to different types of trees. Trees are often really common. And one of my favorite analogies is to think about the difference between a cliff, like a cliff that's jutting out to sea, and the water and the waves that are crashing on the rocks below it. And when we think about a cliff, we tend to think about something that's pretty strong, pretty sturdy, pretty immovable. It's very fixed, strong, tough rock. And that's often an image that would spring to mind in terms of something that we consider resilient. People sometimes talk about oak trees, they talk about rocks, they talk about something that in their mind feels solid and strong. But then if we make the comparison to the water, something interesting starts coming to mind. So with a cliff, what happens with that water is that over time, those waves, as it crashes through, will start to erode the cliff. It'll start to crumble, to eat away at it. And the cliff will take on a different shape, but at some point it may start to fall down. It may start to fall into the sea. And that water that is being stopped in a way by the cliff is finding a way through. It is adapting. And anyone who's ever built a dam as a child will know that we put the rocks up and the water stops for a bit, but eventually it starts to seep through. And the thing about water is, although it feels fluid and sometimes a little bit intangible, it always finds a way to make its way to where it needs to be. And to do that, it adapts, it changes, it may freeze over time, it may unfreeze, it can take different shapes and different forms, but it finds a path to where it needs to be. And resilience is a little bit like that too. It's about not necessarily not being stopped in your tracks for a period of time. It's not about being immovable and unchanged. It's about how you continue to see where it is that you want to get to, or the place to where you feel okay. and keeping that in mind and being able to flex and adapt to the challenges that are thrown at you. So I want to leave you with that thought for this week's episode. As always, please do reach out to me and let me know what you think. You can find me on Instagram, Resilience at Work. You can find me on Facebook in the Everyday Adventure Club, or go and visit my website, resiliencework.co.uk, and drop me an email, drop me a line, and I'd absolutely love to hear from you. I will be back again next week with another incredible guest. This will be at our new time of 6:00 next Friday to talk about all things everyday adventure. And I look forward to speaking to you then. Bye.